The morning air was sharp and unforgiving. A thin layer of frost clung to the edges of the sidewalk as the city slowly woke up. Cars passed in steady lines, their tires hissing against the damp street. Storefront lights flickered on one by one, including a small neighborhood bakery near the corner. The smell of fresh bread drifted out through the open door. A black woman in her early 30s stopped in front of the bakery window. She wore a simple coat, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression calm but tired in the way of someone starting a long day. She glanced at the rows of bread inside, then reached for the door handle. Before stepping in, she noticed him. An elderly homeless man sat against the brick wall beside the bakery. His coat was worn and frayed at the sleeves. His hands were rough and ungloved, folded tightly in his lap to keep warm. He didn't ask for money. He didn't look up at people passing by. His eyes were fixed on the bread behind the glass. The woman paused. People walked past him without slowing. Some avoided eye contact. Others glanced briefly and kept moving, focused on their own schedules. The city had learned how to ignore moments like this. She hesitated only for a second, then went inside. The bakery was warm, filled with the quiet hum of morning business. She ordered a sandwich and waited near the counter, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. As she paid, she glanced back toward the window again. The man was still there. She took her order and stepped back outside. The cold hit her immediately. She walked a few steps, then stopped. Without turning it into a moment, without calling attention to herself, she went back toward the brick wall. "Excuse me," she said softly. The man looked up, surprised. His eyes were tired, cautious, used to disappointment. She held out the sandwich, still warm in its paper wrapping. "You look like you could use this." He stared at it for a moment, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. Then he reached out slowly, as if afraid it might disappear. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded. "Have a good morning." There was no lecture, no question, no expectation of gratitude beyond those two words. She turned and walked away, blending back into the flow of the street. Behind her, the man unwrapped the sandwich carefully. Steam rose into the cold air. He took his first bite slowly, as if reminding himself it was real. Around them, the city kept moving. No one noticed. No one stopped. But something small had already begun. The woman didn't go far. She walked half a block before the noise of the street settled back into its usual rhythm. Car doors closed. A bus hissed at the curb. People hurried past with phones pressed to their ears. The moment outside the bakery already felt finished. But behind her, the man remained seated against the brick wall. He held the sandwich in both hands, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. For a long moment, he didn't eat. He simply looked at it, as if trying to understand why it was there. He had learned not to expect kindness. When he finally took a bite, he did it carefully, slowly, afraid to rush something that might be gone too soon. The bread was soft. The food was fresh. It wasn't leftovers or charity handed out at the end of the day. It was something made for someone else, then given to him. That mattered. A man walking past glanced down at him and then away. A woman crossed the street to avoid getting too close. The reactions were familiar. They didn't bother him anymore. What stayed with him was the woman's face. She hadn't looked afraid. She hadn't looked sorry for him either. She had simply seen him, made a decision, and moved on with her day. Halfway through the sandwich, he wrapped it back up. He looked down the street and noticed another man sitting near the bus stop. Bundled in layers, his shoulders slumped forward against the cold. The older man stood up slowly, joints stiff from the pavement, and walked over. He held out the remaining half of the sandwich. The other man looked up in surprise. "You sure?" he asked. The older man nodded. "I've had enough." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. When the woman reached the end of the block, she didn't turn around. She had already moved on to the next part of her morning, work. Responsibilities, routines that filled her days. She didn't tell anyone what she had done. There was no reason to. Back at the bakery, the window reflected the street like nothing had happened. But for the man on the sidewalk, the choice she made stayed with him long after the sandwich was gone. It wasn't about the food. It was about being treated like someone who still belonged to the world moving around him. As the morning passed, he gathered his few belongings and prepared to move on. He didn't know where he would sleep that night. But for the first time in a long while, he carried something with him that wasn't just hunger or regret. He carried a reason to keep going. The woman slowed as she reached the corner. She hadn't planned to stop again. Her mind was already shifting toward the rest of the day, meetings, errands, responsibilities waiting ahead, but something made her pause. She turned slightly and glanced back toward the bakery. The man was still there. He wasn't eating anymore. He was standing now, holding the paper wrapping carefully, speaking quietly to another man near the bus stop. When she realized what was happening, she stopped. He was sharing the sandwich. The woman hesitated, then walked back. "Hi," she said gently, not wanting to interrupt. The older man turned, surprised to see her again. He gestured toward the other man. "He needed it too." She nodded. "I saw." For a moment, none of them spoke. The street noise filled the space between their words. A bus pulled away. Someone laughed across the street. Life moved on, as it always did. The woman looked at the older man. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. He thought for a second. "Long enough," he said. "Long enough to forget what it feels like when someone doesn't look past you." She didn't push for details. She had learned that questions could sometimes feel like pressure. "I didn't mean to make it a big thing," she said. "I just had extra." He shook his head slowly. "It was more than that," he replied. "You didn't hesitate." That caught her off guard. "I did," she said honestly. "Just for a second." He smiled faintly. "That's the second that counts." They stood there for another moment, neither in a hurry now. The other man thanked him quietly and moved toward the bus stop, leaving the two of them alone again. The woman adjusted her coat. "I should go," she said. "Of course," he replied. She turned to leave, then stopped. "Take care of yourself," she said. He nodded. "I will." As she walked away this time, she didn't look back. The man sat down again against the brick wall, folding the empty paper neatly and placing it in his pocket. The morning had changed, though the street looked the same as before. For her, it was a brief interruption in an ordinary day. For him, it was a reminder that people still noticed, that small choices still mattered, and that sometimes, a conversation you never expected could stay with you far longer than the words that were spoken. The woman continued down the street, blending back into the rhythm of the city. Her pace quickened as she checked the time, adjusting her coat against the cold. The bakery corner disappeared behind her as traffic noise and crowded sidewalks took over. Within minutes, she was surrounded by office buildings, crosswalk signals, and people focused on where they needed to be next. Her phone buzzed with a reminder for the morning ahead. She slipped it into her pocket and kept walking. The encounter already felt distant, like something small that happened between larger obligations. She didn't regret it. She didn't dwell on it either. In her mind, it was finished. Back at the bakery, the older man remained where he was. He sat quietly against the brick wall, watching the crowd move past him. People came and went, each carrying their own concerns, their own urgency. No one noticed the empty paper in his pocket or the careful way he folded it again and again. He thought about the woman. Not her face alone, but the way she had spoken to him. Calm, direct, unafraid. It had been a long time since someone had addressed him without suspicion or pity. By late morning, the cold had eased slightly. The man stood up and gathered his belongings, an old backpack, a blanket rolled tight, and a few items he carried everywhere. He moved away from the bakery, heading toward the quieter streets where he knew he could sit without being asked to leave. As he walked, he passed storefronts filled with things he couldn't afford and people who didn't see him. He didn't feel angry about it. That anger had worn itself out long ago. What stayed with him was something else. Choice. The woman had made one without expecting anything in return. And he had made one too. When he shared what little he had left. The city hadn't changed. His situation hadn't changed either. But his thinking had. By the time the afternoon settled in, the woman was deep into her routine. Meetings ran longer than expected. Coffee cooled untouched on her desk. The morning outside the bakery faded into the background, replaced by tasks and conversations that demanded her attention. She didn't mention the man to anyone. She didn't need to. Across the city, the older man found a place to sit as the day moved on. He watched the light shift and thought about the next steps he hadn't considered in a long time. They were living in different worlds, walking different paths. But for a brief moment that morning, those worlds had crossed. And the effect of that crossing was still unfolding. Night came quietly. The city lights turned on one by one, reflecting off wet pavement as the temperature dropped again. Storefronts closed, buses ran less frequently, and the steady rush of daytime movement gave way to something slower and more uncertain. The older man found a place near the edge of a small park, sheltered from the wind by a row of trees. It wasn't much, but it was familiar. He spread his blanket carefully and sat down, rubbing his hands together to keep them warm. Around him, others gathered in small clusters, people who knew the rules of the night, who knew where it was safer to sit and when to move. Conversations were brief. No one asked many questions. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded paper from earlier that morning. He unfolded it slowly, though it was empty now. He didn't know why he had kept it. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was the reminder. Either way, he smoothed it out on his knee and stared at it for a moment longer than necessary. Nearby, a younger man shifted closer to the light of a street lamp. He looked tired, thinner than he should have been, his jacket barely holding together at the seams. He watched the older man quietly. "You eat today?" the younger man asked. The older man nodded. "This morning." He hesitated, then reached into his bag and pulled out a small roll he had been given later that afternoon. He broke it in half without comment and handed part of it over. The younger man blinked. "You don't have to." "I know," the older man replied. "That's why." They ate in silence. There were no speeches, no lessons, just two people sharing what they had left. Later, as the park grew quieter, the older man leaned back against the tree and closed his eyes. Sleep came in short stretches, broken by the cold and the distant sounds of traffic. But his thoughts stayed clear. He thought again of the woman outside the bakery, of how she had given without hesitation, and then walked away without looking back. That was what stayed with him. Not the sandwich. The way she trusted that kindness didn't need supervision. By the time morning approached, he had already made a decision. It wasn't a plan yet, just a direction, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. As the sky began to lighten, the city prepared to wake again. And the older man stood up, ready to move, carrying with him more than just what fit in his bag. Morning returned with a softer light. The woman stepped off the bus and walked the familiar route toward the bakery. The air was still cold, but not as sharp as the day before. She adjusted her coat and checked the time, already thinking ahead to the schedule waiting for her. As she approached the corner, her eyes moved instinctively toward the brick wall beside the bakery. The space was empty. No blanket, no backpack, no familiar figure sitting quietly against the wall. She slowed her pace. For a brief moment, she wasn't sure why she noticed. People came and went every day. No one stayed in the same place for long. She reminded herself of that as she reached the bakery door. Inside, the smell of fresh bread filled the room again. The same shelves, the same counter, the same routine. She ordered her coffee and stood near the window, glancing outside once more. Still nothing. The woman felt an unexpected pause settle in her chest. Not worry, not disappointment, just a sense of absence she hadn't expected to feel. She took her coffee and stepped back outside. The street was already busier now. People lined up at the crosswalk. A delivery truck pulled to the curb. Life had moved forward without leaving a trace of the man she had spoken to. She walked a few steps, then stopped. For a moment, she wondered if he had found a better place. Somewhere warmer, somewhere safer. She hoped so. Then she continued on. Across the city, the older man was already moving. He stood near a day labor office, watching others line up for temporary work. He didn't expect much. He hadn't in a long time. But that morning, he stepped forward instead of standing back. When it was his turn, he spoke quietly. He answered questions honestly. He waited. Hours later, he left with nothing promised, but something had shifted. He had shown up. That was new. By midday, the woman was deep into her routine again. Meetings blurred together. Emails stacked up. The morning outside the bakery faded into the background. Still, once or twice, her thoughts returned to that empty spot by the wall. She didn't know it yet, but the absence she noticed wasn't an ending. It was a change. And both of them, separated by streets, schedules, and circumstances, were already moving toward what would come next. The afternoon passed without incident. By early evening, the street outside the bakery had slowed again. The morning rush was gone, replaced by a steadier, quieter flow of people heading home. The woman stepped off the bus and walked the same route she had taken that morning. Her thoughts focused on dinner and the evening ahead. As she approached the bakery corner, she noticed someone standing near the window. At first, she didn't recognize him. The man stood upright now, his shoulders squared beneath a clean jacket that looked recently washed. His hair was combed back, his beard trimmed. He wasn't sitting against the wall. He wasn't blending into the background. He was waiting. When he saw her, his expression changed, not surprise, but recognition. He took a small step forward, careful not to startle her. "Excuse me," he said. She slowed and looked at him more closely. It took a second for the familiarity to settle in. "It's you," she said. "Yes," he replied. "I wasn't sure you'd come by this way again." She glanced at the empty wall beside the bakery, then back at him. "You look different," she said. He nodded. "I feel different." They stood there for a moment, the city moving around them. He didn't rush to explain. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to thank you," he said, properly. "You already did," she replied. "You didn't have to wait." "I did," he said quietly. "Yesterday mattered to me." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. It wasn't thick, just a single piece of folded paper inside. "I found some day work this morning," he said. "It's not much, but it's a start." She didn't reach for the envelope. She simply listened. "I remembered how you treated me," he continued, "not like a problem to solve, just like a person passing through your day." He held the envelope out. "This is for the bakery," he said. "For the sandwich." She hesitated, then gently pushed his hand back toward him. "Keep it," she said. "You earned it." He shook his head. "Then take this instead." He unfolded the paper and showed her a receipt from the bakery, dated that morning. He had been inside earlier and paid for a sandwich. "I wanted to return what was given," he said. She looked at the paper, then back at him. For the first time since they met, she smiled. The woman studied the receipt for a moment longer than she expected to. It wasn't the amount that caught her attention. It was the time printed near the bottom. Early that morning, before she had arrived, before she had noticed the empty spot by the wall. "You were here already," she said. He nodded. "I didn't want to miss you again." She folded the receipt carefully and handed it back to him. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why I wanted to." They stood there quietly, the bakery window glowing behind them as evening settled in. The streetlights had just begun to flicker on, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. "I thought about what you said yesterday," he continued, "about not making it a big thing." She looked at him, curious. "I don't remember saying that." "You didn't," he said, "but you showed it." He explained that after they spoke, he had gone to a day labor office nearby. He hadn't expected much. He hadn't expected anything at all. But he showed up, signed his name, and waited. "I got a few hours of work," he said. "Enough to eat, enough to clean up." She listened without interrupting. "When I finished," he went on, "I came back here. I wanted to do one thing before anything else." He gestured toward the bakery door. "I bought a sandwich. Same kind." She glanced inside, then back at him. "And? I left it paid for," he said, "for the next person who needs it." The words settled between them. She hadn't expected that. Not because it was too small, but because it was so deliberate. "That was your surprise?" she asked. He nodded. "Kindness doesn't stop when it changes hands," he said. "It moves." She felt something shift in her chest. Not pride, not relief, something quieter. "I'm glad you came back," she said. "So am I," he replied. They stood there for another moment, neither in a hurry now. The bakery door opened briefly as someone stepped out, then closed again. "I won't be here tomorrow," he said finally, "but I wanted you to know." She nodded. I know. They exchanged a final look, no promises, no expectations, and then he turned and walked down the street, blending into the evening crowd. She watched him go, then turned toward the bakery window once more. Inside, the sandwiches waited, warm and ordinary. But one of them already meant more than she had imagined. The woman didn't expect to see him again that evening. But as she finished her errand and turned back toward the bus stop, she noticed him sitting at a small outdoor table near the bakery. A cup of coffee in front of him. He wasn't eating, he was just sitting there, watching people pass. She hesitated, then approached. Mind if I sit? She asked. He looked up and nodded. Of course. They sat across from each other, the street noise filling the space between them. For a moment, neither spoke. The surprise from earlier still lingered, but now it felt settled, like something that had found its place. You said yesterday mattered to you, she said. Why? He took a breath, then answered carefully. I didn't always live like this, he said. I worked construction, had an apartment, paid my bills. She listened. Then I got hurt, he continued. Couldn't work for a while. Bills piled up. One missed payment turned into another. I lost the apartment before I knew how far behind I was. He looked down at his hands. After that, things moved fast. She didn't interrupt. I stayed with friends for a bit, he said, did odd jobs, but it's hard to climb back once you fall. People stop seeing you as temporary. They start seeing you as permanent. The woman nodded slowly. When you handed me that sandwich, he said, it wasn't the food that surprised me. It was that you didn't ask what happened to me first. She frowned slightly. Why would I? Most people do, he replied. They want to know how you failed before they decide if you deserve help. The words landed quietly. I came back today because I didn't want yesterday to be the only good moment, he said. I wanted to turn it into something that lasted longer than one meal. She looked toward the bakery window, then back at him. You already did, she said. He smiled faintly. I'm trying. They sat in silence again, watching the evening crowd thin. Eventually, he stood and picked up his jacket. I don't know where I'll be next week, he said, but I won't forget this. She stood as well. Neither will I. They exchanged a brief nod, nothing dramatic, and went their separate ways. But as the woman boarded the bus, she realized something had changed. Not the world. Just the way she saw it. The next morning arrived quietly. The woman stepped off the bus and walked past the bakery once again. The street already awake with movement. She glanced toward the brick wall out of habit. It was empty. No blanket, no backpack, no familiar figure waiting in the cold. She didn't stop this time. Inside the bakery, the line moved slowly. She ordered her coffee and stood near the counter, watching the routine unfold. The shelves were full. The air was warm. Everything looked exactly the same. But something felt different. As she reached for her cup, the cashier nodded toward a small sign taped near the register. It wasn't large, just a handwritten note. One sandwich paid forward. The woman paused. She didn't ask who had left it. She already knew. She smiled softly, took her coffee, and stepped back outside. The city moved around her as it always had, busy, distracted, indifferent to quiet moments that didn't announce themselves. Across town, the older man stood near a construction site, waiting with a small group of others. The work wasn't guaranteed. It rarely was, but he showed up anyway, wearing clean clothes, holding himself differently now. When his name was called, he stepped forward without hesitation. Later that afternoon, he stopped by the bakery once more. He didn't go inside. He stood across the street for a moment, watching through the window as customers came and went. Then he turned and walked on. Days passed. The woman continued her routine. Work filled her hours. The bakery remained just another stop along the way. She didn't tell the story to friends. She didn't look for updates. There was nothing to follow up on. That was the point. Weeks later, the bakery window displayed a new note. Community board, help offered. Help needed. The woman noticed it as she passed and thought of the man she might never see again. She thought of the sandwich. Of the choice that took less than a minute and changed more than either of them had expected. Kindness hadn't solved everything. But it had moved. From one person to another. From one morning to the next. Quietly, without permission, without needing credit. As she walked away, the city carried on, unaware, unchanged, and yet subtly different. Because somewhere within it, a small act had traveled farther than either of them could see. And it was still going.